So the book, Like Dreamers, is a riveting book that explores powerful dreams and love of country as seen through the eyes of 7 iconic soldiers, Israeli paratroopers, who shaped Israel's history. The book traces the lives of the soldiers who took part in the battle for Jerusalem in 1967, crossed the Suez Canal in 1973, and of course changed the course of the Yom Kippur War. But between the wars and after the wars, as Yossi recounts, not only did these 7 men not disappear, but they played pivotal roles in affecting the country's destiny. So Yossi, these 7 men had incredibly different visions for Israel's future, and yet you call the book Like Dreamers. What is the significance of the title, and tell us a little bit about the evolution of this book?
The title, Like Dreamers, comes from the Psalms, and it's Psalm 126. When the Lord returned the exiles to Zion, we were like dreamers. And I was always fascinated, and that's not even a strong enough word. I was obsessed with the question, even as an American Jew growing up in New York in the 60s and 70s, before I moved to Israel in 1982, obsessed with the question, what is actually happening over there? What is Israel like? What happened when the Jews actually came home? And we all know the big picture. We know the headlines. But I wanted to know the texture, the back pages of this story. And that's, I think, one reason why I moved to Israel in 1982. And I moved to Israel as both an immigrant and a journalist. And for me, those were, in a way, 2 facets of the same motivation to be part of Israeli society and to understand Israeli society. And you did something similar. You moved to Israel and you were a journalist. And
you stayed.
I stayed, well, and I had a book to write. So, and there was really this sense of what happens when you turn a dream into reality? What is the process? What do you lose and what do you gain in turning a dream into reality? And so this book really, I'd say the genesis of this book came with my first trip to Israel in the summer of 1967. I was 14 years old, a Brooklyn boy. And my father, a Holocaust survivor, said, we're going to Israel. He had 2 brothers who had survived the war and were living in Israel. And he could no longer keep away. And I think that was a very common sentiment among many American Jews in the summer of '67. We wanted to be there. We wanted to touch the radiance of Israel. And I began writing this book in the year 2002 when Right On for Israel began. Think of how many graduates you've turned out since then. And while I was working on this one book, so the genesis really of the book begins with the question: how did we get from that euphoric summer of 1967 to the despair of the Second Intifada? And if you'll remember, the period between 2000 and 2004 was, to my mind, the worst time in the history of Israel, when buses were blowing up. Cafes were blowing up, and there was this sense of the battleground being moved into the home front. For the first time since 1948, the Israeli home front became the main target of the war. And I thought I wanted to tell the story of those 4 decades, from June '67 till the year 2000, and I thought that the paratroopers who had fought in Jerusalem and in some sense had metaphorically brought me to Israel, because the summer of 1967 belonged to them. And what happened to them as a result of the 6-Day War? I know what happened to me. I ended up moving to Israel that summer transformed my life. But what happened to them? And how did both the victory and the subsequent years play out in their lives? And what effect did they have on Israeli society? And so I began to research this group and discovered that the leaders of both the West Bank settlement movement and of the anti-settlement peace movement both came out of the same extraordinary group of soldiers. So this became a way of telling the story of left and right, but it became, as I went more deeply into the story, I'd say the focus really began to change as well. Not just the story of left and right, but the fate of the big dreams that we brought with us back to Zion. And we imposed vast dreams on this little strip of tormented land. And these dreams began with the kibbutz movement, the socialist movement, and socialist Zionism. And the dream of the kibbutz was creating an egalitarian, a democratic form of communism, that Israel would be the world's laboratory for the purest, most democratic form of communism. And then the next big dream to come along was the settlement movement. The settlement movement dreamed of transforming Israel literally through the coming of the Messiah. And then the next big dream that came after that was Shimon Peres's New Middle East of the 90s. And so each of these successive dreams, which defined Israel, shaped Israel, and then came up against reality. And one by one, each of these dreams faltered. And so the book became something more than just the chronicle of Peace Now versus the settlement movement, but the fate of our big dreams, which is why it's called Like Dreamers.
So the subheading is the paratroopers who reunified the city of Jerusalem and divided a nation. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is extraordinary that these men who become leaders in the settlement movement and leaders of Peace Now, and one extremist in the anti-Zionist terrorist underground, were all the people who really wrote the next chapter of Jewish history in unifying the country, but mm-hmm. brought down upon the country these vastly different ideologies and divisions.
Yeah, I mean it's an extraordinary expression, I think, of the vitality of Israelis. That these men fought 2, 3, some of them 4 wars, and rather, as you know, than as you said in your introduction, rather than just disappear into civilian anonymity, they took responsibility for the destiny of the country, not just defending Israel militarily, but trying to shape the nature of Israeli society. And they went from fighting together as comrades in arms to then fighting each other to determine the future of Israel. And so I don't think there's another citizenry anywhere that I can think of in any country where people take such personal responsibility for the fate of their country, defending Israel militarily and then trying to actively shape it politically, socially. And that, I think, is I mean, one of the unanswered questions for me that I leave open in this book is can one imagine Israel without these vast dreams? Even though I think this book takes a hard judgment on these dreams. But is it possible to really imagine the vitality of Israel without these animating, successive utopian dreams?
Yossi, Tom Brokaw described the veterans of the Second World War, American veterans of the Second World War, as America's greatest generation. Mm-hmm. Would you call the men of the 55th Brigade and others who conquered Jerusalem, unified Jerusalem, who won the war in '67, Israel's greatest generation?
I would actually call them the second greatest generation, which wouldn't make a very good title for a book. But the reason I say that is because the greatest generation was the generation that actually founded the state. It was a generation that took us from the Holocaust to sovereignty and power in the span of the same generation. It's just simply, I think, the most extraordinary story in Jewish history, including the Bible. I think that the story of the Jews in the mid-20th century is the great Jewish story. And as one of my characters, the old Ben Nun, says at the end of the book, I hope I'm not giving anything away here, but what he says is that in the future, Jews will celebrate or commemorate the creation of Israel with even greater devotion than we commemorate the Exodus from Egypt. And my intuition is that that's right. So these men actually grew up in the shadow of that extraordinary generation, the generation that created the state. And they had a fairly strong inferiority complex growing up. They felt in the 1950s, when these men were coming of age, early 60s, I think they felt really that history had passed them by. And so the Six-Day War was a gift to them. It really, what they delivered was the greatest military victory in Jewish history. And so they felt in some sense vindicated. And then they proceeded to try to make sense of that victory. And then the next 40 years is the history of how their internal arguments played out. And in a sense, what I felt as I was studying this generation and researching them was that the rest of us live in their imagination. We inhabit their dreams. And we experienced the results of their conflicting dreams. But the story of Israel from 1967 on becomes the story really of their conflicting visions.
But they were infused with such a great sense of ideology and passion and heroism and the sense of love of country. I don't know if it's a fair question to ask, but are they the last great generation?
I think in a way that the generation today, our kids who are coming of age in a very complicated Middle East and a very complicated Israel are an extraordinary generation. And the reason I say that is because this generation, the generation of the founding of the state, in a way came of age in a much simpler Israel. This was the Israel before the territories, before the occupation, and Israel before the campaign to isolate Israel. And the kids growing up today have to deal with all kinds of complicated issues about Israeliness, about Israel's place in the world. And yet they are, as a generation, as dedicated to protecting Israel as the previous generations were. And the previous generations also had charismatic leaders. I mean, think of Ben Gurion or Menachem Begin. There were inspiring leaders who were able to speak with authority about the dream of return. We don't have leaders like that today. There is no leader in Israel today capable of inspiring young people. And so they have to figure this out in a way on their own, what Israel means to them. And with all of the pressure that Israel is under, and with all the pressure of the moral ambiguities of serving in an army that is by necessity, I believe, we have no choice at this point, enforcing an occupation. Nevertheless, that creates a tremendous dissonance in their understanding of the vision, the dream on the one hand, and the reality on the other. And yet, year after year, these kids show up to reserve duty. When there's a war, they fight with each other for the privilege of going in first to defend the country. It's an extraordinary generation, and they're not praised for it. Instead, they get the Goldstone Commission, and they get condemnations from the international community, and previous generations, this generation, the generation that came of age in the early years of the state, were celebrated around the world. These were heroes. And so I have just tremendous respect for this younger generation of Israelis.
Before I ask you to do a short reading from the book, can you tell us a little bit about the men, the 7 men? You've written, a 500-plus page book, but if you can just sum up in a few sentences who these men were or are.
I think the first thing that I would just like to say, one last comment about the generation that unifies all these men. They are the first generation of sovereign, free Jews in 2,000 years. This is the first generation of Israelis. These are the men who in effect are born, more or less born with the state. Most of them were born in 1946, around then, but they come of age and with the state, and they are seen by their parents as miracles, a Hebrew-speaking sovereign generation. And I remember years ago reading Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, the novel about the first generation of Indians, the generation of Indians that were literally born at midnight with the creation of India. And I always wanted to tell the story of our Midnight's Children. And so that's who these men are. And I think it's really important to understand that this is the generation that was born immediately after the Holocaust, but into the joy of sovereign Israel. And I think they carried that dichotomy in their being. And that also explains to a large degree their extraordinary sense of responsibility for this story. Each of these men felt that he's carrying the story of Israel. This is, I am personally responsible for the fate of this story. So the way this plays out in terms of this group is that they represent virtually the full range of political possibilities that the '67 war opened up for Israel. From the right to the left, and even as you mentioned earlier, there's one character who went so far left that he joined an anti-Zionist group and went to Damascus illegally in 1972 to try to establish a joint Arab-Jewish anti-Zionist terrorist group, and came back to Israel, was arrested. This was a very famous trial in early 1973, and spent 12 years in an Israeli prison. And this was headlines, banner headlines for months in the winter and spring of '73. So what really unites these men in a sense is that personal responsibility, and each of them taking it in radically different directions. One of the men, Hanan Porat, became the founder of the first West Bank settlement, and then after the Yom Kippur War founds the settlement movement, Gush Emunim. He's actually wounded in the war, and he founds the settlement movement in his hospital room while he's recovering. And another of these men was wounded, a kibbutznik, Avital Geva, who was wounded in the '67 war. And in the Yom Kippur War, he was leading his men in house-to-house combat in Suez City, which was the final battle of the war. And they come to the main street in Suez City, Egyptian soldiers on one side, Avital's men on the other. 12 noon, ceasefire, all shooting stops. And Avital suddenly sees that his men are walking toward the middle of the street. And he sees that Egyptian soldiers are walking toward the middle of the street from the other side. They meet, the Israelis and the Egyptians, and they shake hands. 5 minutes earlier, they're shooting at each other. Some of the men embrace. Avital's response to this is to say, I see the possibility of Middle East peace. It can really happen. And he then goes on to become one of the founders of the anti-settlement Peace Now movement. So that gives you an idea, I'd say, of the range of characters and of the common ground, the shared experience of these men who come from at least metaphorically and in some cases literally, the same tent, and yet then move in such radically diverse directions.
It's now 40 years since the Yom Kippur War. A month later, and I know that you have something that you've chosen to read from that war.
Yeah, the section here that I'd like to read is about one of the paratroopers. His name is Meir Ariel. And when I mentioned to Israelis that Meir Ariel is one of the characters in the book, the invariable answer is Meir Ariel was a paratrooper in Jerusalem. Now, the name Meir Ariel, unfortunately, doesn't mean much to an American audience. He is our Bob Dylan. He is the great poet balladeer of the last generation. He died in 1999. And he is one of the main characters in the book. Kibbutznik, bohemian, later on in life becomes an observant Jew. And the part that I'm going to read is about Meir in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. So as Linda mentioned, we've been commemorating in Israel the 40th anniversary of the war. And this is a section about Meir with his unit. They are camped in Suez City. They're waiting to be discharged. And the reservists were kept in uniform for months after the war because it was a time of tremendous uncertainty. So this section is happening probably November, December 1973, 40 years ago today. And in it, Meir is having a nervous breakdown. It is the beginning of his nervous breakdown. And I'm reading this section, I chose this section because I think it says something really wonderful about Israel and the Israeli army. And I'll hope that that will come across. In mid-November, another ceasefire was negotiated, this time directly between Egyptian and Israeli officers. It was a hopeful moment, the first face-to-face negotiations between the two adversaries since the 1949 armistice. But for Meir and his friends living in an abandoned youth hostel in Suez City, the ceasefire simply meant a reduction in the level of fighting. Every so often, the Egyptians would remember the Israelis across the way and fire a single mortar, and Meir's crew would fire a single shell back. Life in Suez City settled into routine. There was guard duty and hunting expeditions for sheep and calves to roast at the campfires, where the stubble-faced men in woolen caps chain-smoked and argued into the night about the government's failures and sang the old songs, already nostalgic for a fading Israel. Meir taught the men his songs. They sang Legend of the Lawn about teenage love on the kibbutz in the midst of the entangled collective. Quote, "There's a pile of chevra on the grass." Chevra is the gang. There's a pile of chevra on the grass. Someone suggested a post-Yom Kippur War version. There's a pile of grass on the chevra. The men loved our Meir, this pure soul who never argued or gossiped or raised his voice, who listened to their woes and was always ready with a kind word, or when words seemed inadequate, a sad, empathic smile. One of the men lost his home leave and was inconsolable. Meir held him until he calmed. But as the weeks went on, Meir became withdrawn. "Let him be," the men said to each other. Meir was brooding over his wife, Tirza. As soon as he returned home from the war, she intended to leave for America to try her luck as an actress. She was beautiful, she had learned English in Detroit, and while doing some modeling in Tel Aviv, she'd met an American movie producer who offered to be her patron. Meir was devastated. He loved Tirzah madly, which was the only way to love Tirzah, the only way Meir could love. She said she'd be gone for a year, but who knew what could happen in a year? It wasn't only Tirzah. Meir's life moved between army and kibbutz, communal impositions. He showed no anger, only what one friend described as a sad stillness. The strap of his gun tore, and Meir didn't bother replacing it. He gripped the gun by its barrel, carrying it as an afterthought. One day, on patrol with his Jeep, Meir suddenly called out, "I need to go back. I forgot something." The Jeep pulled up in front of the hostel, and Meir ran inside and reemerged with his gun. Morning lineup in the courtyard of the hostel. 30 helmeted men stood at ease in a ragged row, reservist style. The daily inspection. Were the guns oiled, bullet clips filled? Strap hanging from his helmet, bootlaces open, Meir dragged his gun on the ground behind him and joined the line. "Meir," said the commander sympathetically, "I have a suggestion. Why don't you bring your guitar for inspection?" It's supposed to be funny. The next morning, Meir showed up with gun and guitar. "Are the strings properly tuned?" the commander asked. "Everything is in order," said Meir. And the reason I love this part is because it really says something about the Israeli army and how Meir's commander reached out to him and allowed him the space to go through whatever he needed to.
The level of detail is just extraordinary. I mean, it reads in some ways like a novel. The stories go from the battlefield to the bedroom. You actually admit that you didn't know when you started the book that the men that were the paratroopers that were involved in capturing the old city and reuniting Jerusalem were actually responsible for crossing the Suez Canal.
Oh yeah, I didn't know anything about these men when I started.
And you tell the story of Arik Achmon, who thought that who is this American? And but in 11 years you lived and breathed the stories with.
I almost feel that I have to stop myself from saying we crossed the canal and we fought in Jerusalem. I've been so immersed in this story for so long that I feel I know every detail. And I also know every detail well enough to know when some of the people I was interviewing were telling tall tales. So.
And your interviews were all done in Hebrew?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Our first question from the audience is this. You describe the dichotomy of settlers versus peaceniks as a war. Who do you see as winning the war?
I think the winner, the victor of the war between the left and right in Israel is the center, which is to say that a majority of Israelis today would define themselves as neither left nor right, but as an uneasy combination of both. A centrist Israeli, and according to polls, I would say centrists today are between 60 to 70% of the public. A centrist Israeli believes that the left was correct about the occupation and the right was correct about the peace. And what that means is that a centrist Israeli agrees that if we have a peace partner that's able to deliver a deal, then we should be prepared to make whatever concessions are necessary to reach an agreement. At the same time, a centrist Israeli believes that those conditions do not exist now. We don't, in fact, have a peace partner that's able to deliver on a credible deal. And just as the left was correct about warning about the dangers of occupation, the right was correct about warning about the dangers of a delusional peace process. And so most Israelis today are hawks who want to be doves. That really, I think, is the definition of a center.
Yossi, given the pressures and judgments and difficulties that young Israelis go through, do you think that young Israelis, on some level, are losing faith?
Losing faith in? In the country, the person who asked that question? In the country. It's an Israeli who asked? I mean, it's hard to say. It's a very cynical generation. But I think that the cynicism is a legitimate response to the situation that young Israelis find themselves in today. And what moves me so much about this generation is that they are at the same time deeply cynical and deeply committed to Israel as home. The social protest movement that erupted totally unexpectedly 2 years ago and was the moment when this generation of young Israelis came of age politically and began taking responsibility for the political and social direction of the country, was, I think, an expression of the commitment of this generation to making their home in Israel. And they were demanding of Israeli society, accommodate us. We want to be here. We actually don't want to live in Berlin. We actually would like to be in Tel Aviv. But you have to make it possible for us to be here. So that's how I understood the social protest movement. I think it was a fantastic moment in Israeli history. So I don't see losing faith, certainly losing faith in the political system, which is a very legitimate response, but I don't necessarily see losing faith in the country. That could happen, but I'm very optimistic about what's happening in Israel domestically in the last year or two. The ultra-Orthodox are finally being challenged. The abnormal relationship of the ultra-Orthodox minority to the Israeli majority is being dismantled. The web of privileges that have been in place because of coalition politics for the better part of 30 years is now being dismantled. So I think this is a moment internally, at least. Let's leave aside what's happening on our borders and beyond. But internally, I think this is a moment of tremendous hope for Israel.
Turning back to the book for a moment, when you and I talked yesterday, I asked you why you had chosen Udi Adiv, why you had chosen someone who represented this fringe extremist.
You need to explain because we didn't mention his name.
Udi Adiv. Would you like to
Sure.
explain who he is?
Yeah, Udi Adiv is the paratrooper kibbutznik who went to Syria and spent 12 years in an Israeli jail. And Linda asked me why I had included him. And some of the men in the book were very unhappy with my including Udi as well. They said he's not representative of anyone. And I actually felt that he is representative of a certain stream in Israel today, a very small stream, but nevertheless very vocal. And that is that part of the Israeli elite that has rejected the Zionist narrative. You can read them on the Haaretz op-ed pages. There's a strong part of the liberal arts faculties in universities, in Israeli universities, where post-Zionist and anti-Zionist ideas have taken hold. And so Udi Adiv for me represents the falling out of love with the Zionist narrative that has happened on the part of a small part of the Israeli elite, but very vocal and quite significant abroad. I would say that this slice of the Israeli elite, this disaffected slice, is far more noticed abroad than it is within Israeli society. So Udi represented that for me. And also, as I told some of the men who raised this, I said, just as speaking as a writer, Udi Adiv is a gift. You don't reject a gift like that. And I said, I didn't invent the fact that Udi Adiv was in the paratroopers in Jerusalem. He actually was there. And Udi Adiv is a novel. And in fact, there was an Israeli film that was made based on his story. And it's extraordinary to me that nobody has yet written his biography, because this is really it's just an amazing story. And so I had to include it as a writer.
So I'm actually going to read to you something that caught my eye about Udi that I thought was really emblematic of some of what we see today. You write, Udi and his friends from the anti-Zionist underground proved Zionism's success. Only Zionist empowerment could have made young Jews feel safe enough, barely 25 years after the Holocaust, to despise Jewish power. Mm-hmm. And I saw that resonating even today, that there's something about Jewish power that seems to evoke antipathy internationally. It's unusual that we would have seen that 30, 40, whatever, 50 years ago in Israel itself. But while he may represent the fringe, I think that you wrote something that really speaks to what Jewish power said to him and says to a lot of people today.
Yeah, and I think it's a backhanded compliment to the success of Zionism, that we've created a dynamic that has not only broken with the past of Jewish powerlessness, but reversed it. And 60, 70 years ago, it would have been inconceivable that Jewish power would have been seen in the world as a problem. And the generation before us, my parents' generation, had to contend with the perception of Jews as cowards, which many Jews internalized. You know, this notion of the Jews in Europe going like sheep to slaughter. This was very deep in the generation that preceded us. And to move in one generation from the perception of Jews as cowards who aren't able to defend themselves to this notion that Jews are aggressors, that we have too much power. I mean, this is an extraordinary transition in such a short period of time.
And hard for many people to
hard to handle. I feel very comfortable with Jewish power. I don't feel any need to apologize for that. But in a way, our generation is a transitional generation. We're the generation that really created Jewish power, both in the United States and in Israel. I mean, we're the generation of the Soviet Jewry movement, which was the first time that American Jews really took to the streets and challenged their own government for a Jewish issue, something that the previous generation of American Jews did not do during the Holocaust. And so the emergence of a self-confident, powerful American Jewish community was really born with our generation, in parallel with the emergence of Israel as a military regional power. So it was our generation that made the decision that the condition of powerlessness had become untenable. And for my generation at least, the notion of Jewish power is something to be celebrated and certainly not something to be taken for granted.
Turning to another question from the audience, as a result of the Second Intifada, relationships between Israelis and Palestinians are more distant. Was Oslo a mistake?
My sense is that the two greatest policy mistakes made by the State of Israel were both the results of utopian wishful thinking. The first was the runaway settlement movement, and that was the Likud unleashed the settlement movement when it came to power in 1977. Labor, after the Six-Day War until 1977, when Labor was still running the country, kept the settlements on a very tight leash, and Menachem Begin and the Likud released them. So the first mistake that was made was allowing settlements to be built everywhere on the map. And the second near fatal mistake, I believe, was the Oslo process. And if you look at the situation today, the situation that we're stuck with in the West Bank, we have on the one hand several 100,000 armed Israeli settlers living among Palestinian population. And on the other hand, we have an armed Palestinian Authority which has already fought one terror war against us from 2000 to 2004. So that the first problem was created by the right. The second problem was created by the left. And we're in this kind of limbo now, where the goal of the settlement movement, which was to annex the territories and prevent a Palestinian state, failed. The right succeeded in populating the settlements, in populating the territories with hundreds of thousands of Israelis, but it failed in creating the point of no return where we couldn't create a Palestinian state. And the left's goal, which was in creating the Palestinian Authority to eventually have that turn into a Palestinian state, that hasn't happened either. So what's happened is a partial success of the vision of the right and a partial success of the vision of the left, and we're now stuck with both of these incomplete processes.
For me, at least, I think what makes this required reading for any journalist who will be covering the story in the future is the settlement, is the evolution of the settlements, is the nuanced differences between settler leaders, between Hanan Porat and Yoel Ben Nun. I think there is a perception in the eyes of many Western journalists, and I'm guilty of that too, that there's a fanaticism that drove everybody. Yes, it's true that many settlers who live there today are there because of cheap housing, but what started this movement, the ethos that fueled it, is just a messianic kind of vision that is not shared by most Israelis and that most Western journalists see as crazy and unsupportable. And it was fascinating to read where Hanan Porat, a child of Etzion, who went back to the Etzion bloc, and to understand that Yoel Ben Nun, didn't share all of his views and believed that national unity was the supreme goal. And I think really it's a vital read for people to understand the differences between these people.
Yeah, one of the surprising discoveries for me wasn't necessarily the nuances among the settlers, because as a journalist, I'd been covering that for many years, but it was really discovering what the settlement movement felt like in its early years, which was very different than it feels like today. The optimism and the widespread support among Israelis. One of the first settlement demonstrations was led by Nomi Shemer. Nomi Shemer, former kibbutznik who wrote Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of Gold, the anthem of the Six-Day War, and was really in some sense, the poet-singer of labor Israel. And to realize how in the summer of '67, when a group of Israel's leading writers and poets came together to respond to the Six-Day War, their response was to create a movement to demand settlement. And these were figures, most of them on the left. Natan Alterman, Israel's most beloved poet, and Moshe Shamir, one of the great novelists from the 1948 generation, kibbutznik. So it wasn't what it later became. It was a much more nuanced movement, and so there was something about those lost origins that I was really excited to discover, and so for me this was really in some sense filling in a lot of the gaps in my own Israeli knowledge. How did we get to this point?
Why these men? Someone asked. Why these men in particular?
Well, that was really a question that took me 2 years to answer. When I signed the book contract, I had promised my publisher to deliver a manuscript in 2 years. And after 2 years, I had finally realized who the main characters were going to be. And the groups that I gravitated toward were not only, as I said earlier, not only left and right, but kibbutzniks and religious Zionists. And these were the two groups that, within the paratroopers, there were two distinct social groups and ideological groups. The secular kibbutzniks were the overwhelming majority. At least 50% of the paratroopers of 1967 were kibbutzniks, and probably 70% of the officers. And there was a much smaller group, but also very cohesive, very important, of religious Zionists. And these two movements, the kibbutz and religious Zionism, were the two groups, the two streams within Zionism that wanted more than a normal nation state, that believed that the return to Zion needs to, in some sense, change the world, not just the Jewish people. And these were the two utopian messianic streams. The kibbutzniks believed that Israel and Zionism would change the world by creating a model egalitarian society. And the religious Zionists believed that the return to Zion would change the world by literally bringing the Messiah. So I was interested in focusing on these men because, because they came out of these two utopian streams. And through their lives, I wanted to tell the story of the fate of the kibbutz, the fate of the settlement movement, the fate of the peace movement. And that's how the book coalesced.
Okay, switching gears for 1 minute, and I'm not sure how you feel about answering this, but turning to politics in this country. Do you see the increasing polarization of politics in the United States as a threat to the U.S.-Israel relationship? Are you concerned about the administration's support for Israel? Are you concerned as you watch negotiations with Iran? I mean, what?
Yeah, desperately concerned. I think that we're at potentially a turning point in the American-Israeli relationship. And for the first term of Obama's presidency, the question that Israelis asked was, is he a friend? And I have long felt that that was the wrong question, because President Eisenhower, for example, had personally warm feelings for the Jewish people, but was a terrible president for Israel. And President Bush Sr. Didn't especially have warm feelings for the Jews, but he was a pretty good president for Israel and for the Middle East. So the question that Israelis are asking themselves now about Obama, and finally this is the right question, is after 8 years of the Obama administration, will Israel be safer in the Middle East or less safe? Will the Middle East be more intact or more dangerous place? And I think the answer of most Israelis today is that the Obama administration is dangerous for the future of the Middle East. Dangerous. And nothing expresses that more than the imbalance in the administration's approach with the Palestinians on the one hand, the negotiations with the Palestinians, and Iran on the other. I heard John Kerry speak to the AIPAC summit a couple of weeks ago in Napa, and he spent very brief time speaking about Iran. He said some perfunctory remarks, which we've all heard many times before, but then he went on to speak for 15, 20 minutes about the need for a peace agreement with the Palestinians. And he was lecturing us about the benefits of peace, as if this were the 1990s. Well, we know the benefits of peace. We know that peace is better than war. We also know that peace is better than occupation. But what we don't believe, most of us, is that the conditions in the Middle East are ripe for peace anywhere, let alone between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And the fact that Kerry's passion and energy is being focused not on stopping Iran, but on pursuing an illusion of a final status agreement between Israel and the Palestinians is deeply, deeply worrying. And in terms of the negotiations with Iran, I feel that under this administration, if left to its own devices, which is to say that if Israel doesn't actively intervene as it's doing now, along, surprisingly, with France and more quietly Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. This is the new alliance, by the way. Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and France. It's almost messianic, except that it is an alliance that is created to stop a fatal misstep on the part of the American administration. That's the one little piece that's not messianic in this whole thing, is that it's the American administration that is now being perceived by America's closest allies in the Middle East as a danger. And that is my sense is, and I think the sense in the region, and by the region I mean Israelis, Sunni Arabs, Turks, is that if left to its own devices, the Obama administration would unwittingly preside over the emergence of the next North Korea. Iran, under the Obama negotiating strategy, would become the next North Korea.
So, as I attempt to wrap up the conversation, and I have one final question. I go back to what I said earlier about how you are on the mark, but over 11 years you have become increasingly despairing, and it is an unstable and region becoming more dangerous as the years go by. I wonder if you think it's at all detrimental or destructive at all to Israel and its core to just maintain the status quo without going anywhere. I mean,
the short answer is yes, but we don't have a choice at the moment. And I'm hoping that if we can't reach a negotiated solution with the Palestinians, and we may not be able to, that we will find an appropriate moment to figure out how to perhaps implement another unilateral withdrawal, next time more successfully than we did in Gaza, which is to say leaving the army behind, which we didn't do in Gaza. And I suspect that unilateral withdrawal will be our fallback position if and when we come to that moment where we say, well, it's either, this is the moment when we have to choose between being a democratic state or a Jewish state, and we can't make that choice because those are the two non-negotiable elements of our identity. And if we feel that this is the moment when the occupation is presenting a direct threat, an immediate threat, and I don't think we're there just yet, but an immediate threat to our ability to maintain Israel as a Jewish state and a democratic state, then our fallback position, I think, will be some form of unilateralism. But I just want to correct you about one thing, Linda, which is I'm not at all in despair. I think that one of the lessons that I learned in this immersion in the Israeli story was that there were so many desperate moments in the history of Israel. October 5th, 1973, when there are several hundred Israeli soldiers on both fronts standing between two invading armies, the Egyptian army and the Syrian army, and the Israeli home front. Or those 4 years of suicide bombings that we lived through in the Second Intifada, when you really felt that the solidity of the country was unraveling. We were losing our public space. Israelis were afraid to congregate with other Israelis because you would be a tempting target for terrorists. I mean, that was the low point, I think, in the history of Israel. And so when my wife Sarah and I moved to Israel in 1982, inflation was 300%. And it went over 400%. You would get a paycheck, and you would rush out that day to spend it because it would already be worth much less the next day. Now, there were so many of these awful moments. And when we moved to Israel, there were no immigrants coming. We get to the airport, and we had to wait for hours before an official from the Jewish agency showed up to process us. What? Immigrants from America? You know, and then 3 years later, thousands of Ethiopian Jews show up. And then 8 or 9 years later, 1.5 million Russians show up. And so there's so many variables here. I mean, I go back to Anwar Sadat coming to Israel in 1977. I don't know where you were when he came. I was lying in a hospital room in Washington, D.C. I was in school that year. I was in Washington, and I had gotten jaundice, and I ended up in the hospital. And the TV is on in my room, and I look and I see Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat standing together. I thought I was hallucinating. And you know, what we take for granted now was simply inconceivable. This was a man, Anwar Sadat was one of the most hated men in Israel. He launched a surprise attack on Yom Kippur, was responsible for the deaths of 2,600 Israeli soldiers. 4 years later, he lands in Israel, and people are standing in the street throwing flowers at him. And who's there to make peace with him? The most hard-line Israeli prime minister in history, Menachem Begin. The story is so improbable that it could only happen in the Middle East. And so I'm not at all in despair. And I think that what's happening in the region is, at the moment, is just inconceivable. It's apocalyptic. But I think that the Arab Spring cracked open the Arab world. The Arab world was frozen. It was a civilization that was frozen for centuries. And now it's opened up, and all kinds of pathologies emerge. But I don't believe that's the last word. I think there are many people in the region who want something different. And I believe that the instability that we're experiencing is also creating opportunities for Israel and for parts of the Arab world. And what I mentioned earlier in terms of this new tacit alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia is an expression of how the inconceivable is becoming part of our reality. So I'm not at all in despair. I think it's going to be an incredibly wild ride. It's fasten your seatbelt time in Israel. And there'll be very, very rough times. But I also think that there are real openings and possibilities for positive change.
Thank you. Eloquently said. I think a very good place to end. I want to thank you for fulfilling every expectation that I had for a wildly thoughtful and insightful conversation. Thank you all. Thank you, Yossi.
Thank you all very much. And Linda, thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.